In 1857, police showed up at the doors of over 200 people who legally owned their land. People who had bought their property, built churches, sent their children to school. And the city told them, "You have until morning to get out." They didn't just relocate them. They bulldozed everything, planted trees over the foundations. They called a thriving black community a slum, declared the land public good, and buried the evidence under Central Park. And for over 130 years, New York pretended this neighborhood never existed. This is the story of Seneca Village, and the dirt underneath the most famous park on earth still remembers it. The deeper I went into the land records behind Central Park, the stranger the story became. The official story begins the way these stories always do, with progress. A crowded city, a bold vision, the public good. If you read the mainstream historical accounts from that era, the land chosen for Central Park was described as an empty, useless, rocky wasteland, populated only by transient squatters and roaming pigs. But there's a question nobody asks about progress. Progress for whom? When I started pulling the original census records from 1855, that question got a lot harder to ignore. Because the official version said this land was filthy and barely inhabited. The actual federal and state census ledgers said the exact opposite. When I looked at the area between 82nd and 89th Streets, I didn't see a wasteland. I saw a highly detailed registry of a permanent, functioning, organized town. I saw the records of carpenters, coopers, grocers, and teachers. I saw the addresses for 3 distinct churches, a school, several cemeteries, and perhaps most shockingly, I saw property deeds. Clear, legally binding property deeds showing that these people owned the land they lived on. The official narrative publicly flattened a lawful, organized community into the image of a slum. But why? To understand why the city needed to erase them, we have to look closely at who exactly was living in Seneca Village. Let's look at the emotional core of this community through the life of a single man. His name was Andrew Williams. In 1825, New York was a harsh, deeply segregated place. Slavery had only just begun to be dismantled in the state, a process that wouldn't be fully complete until 1827. For a free black man, finding a safe place to live, let alone build wealth, was incredibly dangerous. Downtown Manhattan was crowded, racist, and prone to violent riots against black residents. Andrew Williams was a 25-year-old bootblack, a shoe shiner. It was an exhausting job, requiring him to work long hours on the dirty streets of Lower Manhattan. But Andrew was remarkably frugal. By September of 1825, he took his life savings, $125, and bought 3 lots of land far uptown in a rural, quiet area near 86th Street. To put that in perspective, $125 was a massive sum for a working-class black man in the 1820s. He didn't just buy dirt, he bought a future. Shortly after Andrew bought his land, another black New Yorker, a store clerk named Epiphany Davis, bought 12 lots nearby for $578. Then came the AME Zion Church, which purchased multiple lots to establish a safe burial ground for black citizens, because downtown cemeteries refused to bury them. Within a few years, a town began to rise. For the black families who moved there, this wasn't just a suburban escape. It was a fortress of autonomy. By 1855, Seneca Village had around 225 residents. The community was roughly two-thirds African American and one-third newly arrived Irish and German immigrants. Think about how extraordinary that is. In the 1850s, while the rest of the country was marching toward a bloody civil war over slavery, here was a working-class, fully integrated neighborhood where Black, Irish, and German families lived side by side, attended each other's churches, and built a society together. At first glance, Seneca Village looks like a story about land. But here is the part that made me stop reading and sit back in my chair. Land wasn't the most dangerous thing these families possessed. In 1821, New York State altered its constitution. They removed the property requirement for white men to vote. But for Black men, they intentionally implemented a severe, almost impossible barrier. To have the right to vote, a Black man had to prove that he owned at least $250 worth of real estate. That was an astronomical sum designed specifically to disenfranchise the Black population. Out of the more than 12,000 Black residents living in New York City in the 1850s, fewer than 100 of them met the property requirement to vote. But look closely at the property deeds of Seneca Village. Over 50% of the Black heads of household in Seneca Village owned their property, and many of their lots were valued at over that $250 threshold. By buying land together, the residents of Seneca Village hadn't just built a neighborhood, they had systematically acquired political voting power in a city that was actively trying to silence them. This wasn't just a neighborhood of residents. It was a neighborhood producing independent Black political power. And that is exactly where the story stops being a park project and starts looking like a removal strategy. So, how do you legally destroy a neighborhood of people who own their land, pay their taxes, and vote? You don't attack them directly. You attack what they are in the eyes of the public. When the city elite decided they wanted Central Park in 1853, the state legislature passed the Central Park Act. This act authorized the use of eminent domain, the legal power of a government to forcibly seize private land for the public good, provided they paid the owners fair market compensation. But seizing a middle-class neighborhood of enfranchised voters is politically difficult. It looks bad. You can't just tell the public that you are bulldozing the beloved homes and schools of hard-working citizens just to build a picturesque playground for the wealthy. They didn't need the public to sympathize with the residents. They only needed the public to stop seeing them as legitimate. I spent weeks pulling the original newspaper clippings from 1855 and 1856. The coordinated campaign of media defamation is chilling to read today. The press, including prominent papers like the New York Daily Times, which received heavy backing from the park's commissioners, began publishing sensationalized, deeply racist descriptions of Seneca Village. They completely ignored the two-story wooden homes. They ignored the 3 active churches. They ignored the integrated school and the manicured gardens entirely. Instead, they called the residents squatters and vagabonds. They described the area as a nigger village, populated by bloodthirsty and wretched inhabitants. Another reporter claimed the area was filled with people who lived in shanties and shared their meals with pigs and stray dogs. The language in these articles isn't just offensive, it's a blueprint. Read it carefully. You'll recognize it. This functioned like a coordinated campaign of bureaucratic and media dehumanization. If the public believes that the land is just a filthy, crime-ridden slum filled with illegal squatters, then bulldozing it isn't an act of violence. It's an act of public sanitation. It's urban renewal. Once the courts accepted the city's framing, the ending was almost inevitable. The residents of Seneca Village didn't go quietly. For 2 agonizing years, they fought the city in court. They filed petitions. They submitted their legally binding property deeds. They demanded the right to stay in the homes they had built with their own hands. But they were fighting a machine that had already erased them in the court of public opinion. The legal system systematically undervalued their property. When the courts finally forced the sale, the compensation offered to the residents was pennies on the dollar. It wasn't nearly enough to buy similar land anywhere else in the rapidly gentrifying city. In the summer of 1857, the final eviction notices were served. Police arrived at the doors of people who had lived there for 30 years. People who had watched their children grow up on these streets. The heavy machinery moved in. The church came down first. Then the school. The most devastating act of destruction wasn't the homes. Decades earlier, the AME Zion Church had specifically purchased lots here to build a cemetery, because downtown white cemeteries refused to bury black citizens. The community had literally built their own sanctuary for their dead, and now the city bulldozed it. The cemeteries were disturbed. Some graves were relocated. Others simply built over. Within months, the entire neighborhood ceased to exist above ground. The city dumped thousands of tons of topsoil over the foundations of Andrew Williams' home. They planted picturesque oak trees over the streets where children used to play. They built walking paths and scenic ponds specifically designed to make it look like nature had always been there. Here is what institutional erasure actually looks like. It isn't one dramatic act of destruction. It's 100 small decisions over 130 years. A tour guide who doesn't mention it. A history textbook that skips it. A plaque that was never built. An archive that nobody funded to catalog. The violence of 1857 took 1 summer. The silence took 6 generations. For 130 years, you could stand on the exact spot where Andrew Williams built his home, and no official, no tour guide, no textbook would tell you what had been there. The erasure didn't just happen in 1857. It was maintained, actively, for generations. The city's version of history held. Until a group of archaeologists started digging. And the ground refused to lie. When archaeologists finally conducted a major excavation in the summer of 2011, the archaeological record sharply contradicted the degrading public portrayals used in the 1850s. Did they find the remnants of a miserable shantytown? No. They dug up the stone foundation of the home belonging to William Godfrey Ray, another prominent black resident. They found fine imported ceramics. They found bone-handled toothbrushes, indicating a high level of personal hygiene and disposable income. They found children's leather shoes. They found roofing slate and fragments of glass windows. The earth itself, preserved under the manufactured hills of Central Park, had held on to the evidence of a prosperous, dignified middle-class life. After the eviction, the residents of Seneca Village scattered across the city. Most of them couldn't buy land again. The compensation was pennies. Their political voice, the voting rights they had built property by property, gone. Andrew Williams, the 25-year-old bootblack who had saved $125 and bought himself a future, disappeared from the historical record. We don't know where he went. We don't know if he ever owned land again. Seneca Village wasn't an isolated incident. It was a prototype. Think of Tulsa's Black Wall Street, destroyed by fire. Think of the thriving black communities wiped out to build the interstate highway system in the 1950s. The mechanisms of removal repeat themselves. The official record called this progress. The soil said otherwise. And once you understand that, Central Park stops looking like empty land transformed by vision. It starts looking like memory covered by landscaping. Central Park is beautiful. That's what makes this story so effective. The violence was hidden inside something people were taught to admire. Under those paths and lawns was a lawful community that had built homes, churches, graves, and political power. And when the city wanted the land, it didn't just remove the people. It wrote them out of the story. Seneca Village matters because it shows how easily public good can become a mask for selective removal. The city spent generations treating that land as if it had been empty. The ground kept a different record. Next time you walk through a beautiful public space, look down. Ask yourself, who was standing here before someone decided this place was empty? The answer is almost never no one. If this investigation made you rethink the history around you, there's a reason for that. We walk over buried histories every single day. But geography isn't the only thing the system can bury. Sometimes they don't bury a town. Next time, the scientific discoveries that saved millions of lives, and the names that were written out of the textbooks along with Seneca Village.